No objection. Who's our first speaker, Corinne?
Professor Ellis is up first.
Take it away, Atiba.
All right, well, first of all, welcome everyone to this panel. And as you know, the title, we are here today to talk about the dangerous mix of democracy and oligarchy and to reflect on the elections. And I know my co-panelists have particular points of departure on this issue, but I've been asked to begin because I am a scholar of the law of democracy, and I write at the intersection of election law and critical theory. So the remarks I want to offer as a kicking off point concern what I am calling the minoritarian tyranny problem of the American democratic process. So there's been great concern regarding an already existing, or for some, an oncoming problem of tyranny of the minority in the United States. And as an initial proposition, I want to start from the place that this problem is inherently linked with anti-Blackness. And because the history of the United States and the history of the democratic mechanism has been rooted in anti-Blackness and the racial subordination that comes from the political economy of slavery. And I'll talk about that in a little bit in my brief remarks here. But this combines in the present day with conservative oligarchical forces, such as President Donald Trump, soon not to be president, which align with entrenched economic power and racial hierarchy in a way that shapes and deforms ab initio the democratic process that the American Republic proclaims to aspire to. You know, this then creates avenues for accumulation of power that have always been protected by the constitutional system, and I don't think they are going to go away anytime soon. Very recently, I heard election law scholar, the famous Pam Karlan, call aspects of this the new counter-majoritarian difficulty, in the sense that the classic literature around the counter-majoritarian difficulty sort of located the problem in the federal courts and the Supreme Court, sort of evoking Alexander Bickel and John Hart Ely. But I come at this in Karlan's frame in as much as the problem isn't just the courts. The problem is the structure. Some of it is hardwired in the constitutional structure, as Karlan has argued, and others of it is about what the Supreme Court has chosen to do. And the confluence of these things, as Karlan would argue, I would extend to this anti-Blackness thesis that I've offered to say that the confluence of racial subordination, oligarchical tendency, and open anti-Blackness, which we are seeing in this election, even though it is coded, which I'll explore briefly, you know, come together to raise deep questions for me about the potential for majoritarianism in the United States, particularly when that majoritarianism is about representing the power of people of color in the political process. And so these mechanisms are entrenched, and given this, let me talk for a moment about how this dilemma of democratic structure has come to manifest itself both historically and in this election. The core points that I want to make here, first of all, is that, you know, contrary to the feeling that all of us, including myself, might feel, I don't think that there is going to be a literal coup d'etat in the United States. But we have seen the Trump administration in its latter days tending towards that kind of ideological preference in order to consolidate power. And in essence, to make a political stand that will not go away even when Trump goes away as late as January 20th. But this means that we have larger problems with the notion and our myth of democratic universalism when it comes to electoral participation and the structure of our process. We are going to confront a moment of minoritarian tyranny. Now, this is undergirded by, first of all, the hardwired issues in the system, including the Electoral College. For example, Donald Trump got elected by the Electoral College, not the popular vote. So it is a sort of counter-majoritarian dilemma baked into the structure of the system. And I need not tell this group that that structure is in and of itself based on anti-Blackness. Think the 3/5 clause of the Constitution and think about the structure that combines that clause with representation based on legislative structures on the state level combined with a winner-take-all system in politics. All of those things come together with the modern manifestation of political gerrymandering in order to entrench power among groups and thus require supermajorities to oust those groups. And in particular, the Republican Party in places like where I live, Wisconsin, has been involved in those acts. So in addition to that, Wisconsin, like North Carolina and Maryland and other places, bring this power dilemma to bear and also reflect on the fact that the courts do not wish to undertake the counter-majoritarian role that was endorsed by Bickle and Ely in their famous works of a generation ago. Because as we saw in Ruccio versus Common Cause, the court has retreated from policing political gerrymandering and thus requiring supermajorities in order to overthrow entrenched power. And the conservative, well-moneyed forces that we have seen represented in the Republican Party have engaged directly in entrenching themselves in this way so that they are difficult to get rid of. Part of the implication of this is that the notion of one person, one vote, and the idea that each individual voter's power ought to be equal no matter what district seems to get undercut by the Supreme Court's willingness to tolerate and in fact retreat from commenting on the problem of political gerrymandering. So we have that form of minoritarian tyranny, both the Electoral College, political gerrymandering, but there is this third form that stems from the American legacy of anti-Blackness. The race-driven tactics such as racial gerrymanders, voter suppression, and I will coin a phrase here, voter negation tactics, which seem to have come to being in the past week, that tend to further impact racial minorities within political jurisdictions. This has the effect of compounding and aggregating the effects of minoritarian tyranny in such a way that from the point of view of addressing race and voting specifically, racial minorities, African Americans, Latinx Americans could find their voting strengths decreased while they become the numerical majority. So we've seen this, for example, in the decisions around Shelby County and the outbreak of voter suppression tactics that came in the wake of Shelby County, and probably the most egregious example in North Carolina NAACP versus McCrory, where the Fourth Circuit, not known for its liberalism, said that the North Carolina legislature targeted Black voters with, quote, almost surgical precision. But lest we forget, racial gerrymandering in Shaw v. Reno, using sort of a perception test to determine whether a racial gerrymander happens, and how that was manipulated in Alabama as recently as 2016 to pack minority voters and decrease Black representation in the Alabama legislature. And let us take a second to think about how what I have called the meme of voter fraud has been used within the politics of late in order to diminish the power of minority votes, or at least attempt to do so, on the claim that it just so happens that the minority strength in cities like Alabama, Philadelphia, and, you know, throughout Arizona was somehow uncredible, and therefore the vote counting must be stopped because of that. And so these are direct attacks echoing the notions of race. I have a lot more to say, and we can talk about it in the Q&A, but my point is that this mix of structural racism, democratic retreat, and oligarchic tendencies, which I would argue Trump voters have embraced, have led us to living in a republic that seems devoid of democratic values. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So next up, we have Professor Jordan.
Atiba, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for opening these comments, and welcome to everybody who came out here on a Friday afternoon to hear us talk. I want to focus on the project of identifying authoritarianism and demagoguery. The fact is that there is a link between those two ideas, and the link is the supporters. So we have a bond between the supporters that is being expressed in its worst and most disgraceful and actually ridiculous form with this counting the votes meme and strategies. So authoritarianism is an effort by supporters who want to be protected from something they fear very deeply. And in this case, we can say this is not new. We are in a transition point. All of the census projections are that America will be a majority minority country in 2045. And Trump came into office riding that fear of his supporters, fear that they would be displaced from the top of the racial hierarchy. And so that central fear is what's driving what appears to be an illogical, irrational bond, which goes as far as it is now with the ridiculous claims about the nature of the vote, even to the point of asserting that Trump won. I could see Trump making that claim, but millions of supporters making that claim, that is an irrationality, which comes from this deep psychological bond between the authoritarian who promises to protect the supporters. So the link between authoritarianism and demagoguery is the supporters. And we are finding those supporters and their fears are displacing and making more explicit the displacement of the democratic controls of our nation. And it's not lost on anyone that Trump came into office after President Obama. So Obama was the embodiment of the fears of the people who were dependent upon these demagogic tactics to protect them from more Obama. And the fact that Obama had 2 terms was especially frightening. So that's the central fear. What is the evidence of this central fear? One of the pieces of evidence that I like to cite is the Bradley effect. In 1982, Tom Bradley was the beloved mayor of Los Angeles. All the polls said he was going to win as he ran for governor of California. That would have made him the first Black governor. But in fact, what happened was the respondents to the poll lied. What were they lying about? They were covering their deep fear that a Black man would be the executive, the chief officer of the state of California. And so we get that Bradley effect, which is simply the discrepancy between the polls and the election results. When there is a white and non-white candidate running against each other. What is the non-white candidate in this election? It is Joe Biden, who is in a space between Barack Obama and Senator Harris. Senator Harris has a multiracial marriage. She represents a multiracial embodiment of the immigrants in our country. And so even though Joe Biden is nominally, for purposes of this contest and the Bradley effect, he is white. He represents that deep fear of the white voter that Blacks are going to take over. And so it produces a lie to the pollsters who say, the respondents say to the pollsters, they're undecided, or they'll lie and say they are for the Black candidate. And in this case, we're talking about Joe Biden. So the people in the social sciences call this the social desirability effect or bias. The fear that they will be labeled racist is what the concern is. Now, how has Trump displayed the protection of his voters? How has he rewarded this bond? He signals to the base that he is strong enough to protect them. How does he do it? By shows of force, using helicopters, pepper spray, and the entire Portland confrontation and the Lafayette Park incident with pepper spray. Use of the identity obscuring tactics, obscuring the identity of the military people who are deployed to the park and also to Portland. He didn't care for any of the boundaries of the democratic rules. He showed his supporters, I'm strong enough to break the rules. That means I'm strong enough to protect you. It's also on display with his attack through executive order on racial sensitivity training, where he has attacked the intellectual foundations of the effort to bring race into the federal workplace to improve the perspective, racial viewpoint of those who are employed by the federal government. So that constitutes his attack. The last thing that I want to talk about is this problem of economic entrenchment. My work focuses on economic inequality, economic justice, and I'm also a banking scholar. And so the last point I want to talk about is the way in which we have seen the distribution of the funds that were intended for minority businesses in a way that provided for the distribution of those funds to cronies of President Trump, fraud, rampant fraud. Every month we get new reports of the fraud in the Paycheck Protection Program. It's a program that has forgiveness, so these loans are fully forgivable. That is important. The banks denounced systemic racism when George Floyd was murdered. But what did they do with this program, the Paycheck Protection Program? There was $660 billion that was available for distribution to minority businesses, small businesses, if they would keep their employees on the payroll. That's why it's called the Paycheck Protection Program. There was the 660 billion available. Where did it go? 349 billion went to a narrow slice, 15% of the applicants who came to get these forgivable loans. How did they get them? They were ushered to the front of the line by the banks, who were chosen by the Treasury Department to be the agents for distribution. Now, lest we think it was just a problem of investment firms and political insiders getting money that was intended for minority businesses, you'd be wrong. A large part of this money was given, 24 billion was given to the banks themselves. They received a fee for these processing loans that had no risk of default. They were guaranteed by the government. So I'm happy to talk about any of these things, the authoritarianism, demagoguery, Bradley effect, or the economic entrenchment problem in Paycheck Protection Program.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Next up, we have Professor Ramirez.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here on a Friday afternoon for this very important panel. I think that the two panelists we've heard from were both outstanding. I'm sure the next two will be outstanding too, and I hope that I can meet that standard. And thanks too to the folks at Yale Law School and the Law and Political Economy Project for sponsoring this event. First, I think that there are some good things that happened on Tuesday, November 3rd, and shortly thereafter that we would be remiss not to focus on, because they make it appear as though we have a very healthy democracy. So, number one, democratic accountability prevailed to remove a otherwise popular incumbent who had presided over the most catastrophic health crisis in our history, I believe. And the 249,000, the nearly 250,000 dead Americans as a result of COVID-19, I think was just too much of a burden for our democracy to handle. And it was a fairly strong rebuke of that administration during that crisis. At last check, it was over 5 million votes. The Electoral College looks like it's going to end up at about 306 to 217. And so there you see democracy working. In terms of turnout, we had historic turnout. It may not be the highest turnout ever, but it's right up there. And certainly in modern times, it's among the highest turnout in terms of presidential election years that we've seen in our lifetime. In terms of violence, there was very little violence associated with the election, notwithstanding many, many warnings that we needed to be on alert. Perhaps that is a testament to the efficacy of law enforcement in nipping violence in the bud in Michigan and other places where those who were prepared to perpetuate violence were arrested and apprehended. And that has a chilling effect across the board with respect to extremism. So I think all of those are positive points, but there are many lowlights to talk about too. One is that we are a deeply split nation, and we're split along many different axes. We have lost trust as part of that split in each other. We have a high degree of suspicion and even hostility towards each other. And although violence did not break out as part of this election, it was certainly threatened. It was certainly discussed. And if we continue on the current path that we continue on, I would suggest that this division is going to get worse. It exposes us to foreign adversaries, and it shows our vulnerability along these divisions, our inability to unite. It shows that we are unable to take effective collective action on things like COVID-19. And I think that there's a certain paralysis that goes hand in hand with that division that keeps us from enacting laws that are needed, and from insisting that governing elites conduct our government in a way that serves the general welfare, the common defense. So I think we've gotten to a point where our internal divisions now are so manifest and so deep that it's a national security issue. We're vulnerable to foreign interference in our elections, in our sort of body politic. They can incite violence. We've seen violence go up in the last 4 years. Hate crimes have spiked, and we've seen even an increase in hate mass murders from El Paso to Pittsburgh. So I think that split is still here after Election Day. I think that the fact that COVID has essentially proved our paralysis and shown a national psychosis that shows a significant portion of Americans are utterly detached from reality. And not only are they detached from reality, but they just really don't care about inflicting risks on others in a way that you would think traditionally American patriotism would counter. But instead, it's now sort of become patriotic to be reckless and to impose risks through things like ignoring social distance mandates, not wearing a mask, really basic things. Similarly, I don't really have much hope after Tuesday's election outcome that we are finally going to deal with climate change, which I think has reached an extinction level of irrationality. We are messing with a biosphere that we don't fully comprehend, and we're messing with it in ways where we don't really understand the consequences. And it's quite clear that this is occurring and that anthropogenic climate change is a very real risk. And yet, like COVID-19, we have a significant part of our population that simply ignores the risks of climate change. And I don't see where our split government that was yielded after the election of November 3rd is going to be able to tackle climate change in anything close to a rational way. I think one of the most pernicious plagues that we face as Americans is the continuing operation of our racial hierarchy. I have taken the position in my scholarship that racial hierarchy imposes more costs every day, because as our nation becomes more diverse, more and more of our co-citizens are caught up in the oppression of our racial hierarchy. And so the cost, as time goes on, the cost of the racial hierarchy that clearly continues to operate in our society become more and more manifest, and we suffer greater and greater loss of opportunity, international credibility, and ability to move collectively to address problems as a direct result of that racial hierarchy. There is a school of thought that all law is politics. I want to turn that upside down and suggest that this election and the presentation of Professor Ellis also shows that all politics is law, in the sense that all political pressure gets channeled by law into different ways of manifesting itself into law and regulation, back into law and regulation. So we've got the law of the structure of the Supreme Court. And 100 years ago, a Congress decided that 9 shall be the magic number of the Supreme Court. And we are burdened with that reality today. And as a result, we have a less democratically responsive court, and we have a court that is now dominated by conservatism, even though Democrats have won 7 out of 8 of the last elections, right? How did that happen? How did that happen? Well, law channeled political pressure in such a way that they were able to get this current Supreme Court configuration in place. And it's the same thing. Professor Ellis was talking about the legal structure of the Senate, right? That every state shall get 2 senators. And that too is a law that channels political reality and reaches into the Electoral College and fundamentally distorts our democracy. So I think what we're seeing here is, I think Professor Ellis used the term of minoritarian governance, and we're seeing that for sure. And it's leading to more and more concentration of power in fewer and fewer hands. We face the prospect of runaway economic inequality, runaway political inequality, and more political and economic power concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. That is the very definition of an oligarchy, and our system not only supports that, but now facilitates it. Going forward, I think because all politics is law and it feeds back into the legal system, I think we need to use law to change the political dynamics on the ground. And I think the best way to do that is the following 4 steps. These are what I suspect are the mechanisms by which law can change the political dynamics that we're faced on the ground today, that were so vividly demonstrated in the election. First, I think we need to end mass incarceration. My co-author on a forthcoming paper, Cummings, will be addressing that. Second, I think we need a federal law prohibiting felony disenfranchisement coast to coast without the payment of any poll tax like what they've pulled in Florida. And I think we have that power under the Equal Protection. The federal government has that power under the Equal Protection Clause and the Elections Clause of the U.S. Constitution. Second, I think we need more democracy in terms of statehood for Puerto Rico and District of Columbia. I believe it is an abomination that those people are disenfranchised in part in our system. And then finally, we need jobs. People freak out economically because jobs are so hard to come by. We need a jobs program, and I think an infrastructure program would help be a first step in accomplishing that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And next up, we have Professor Cummings.
Greetings, everyone. I really wanted to thank my co-panelists for excellent presentations thus far. I'm grateful to everyone that's here attending. Thank you for coming out on a Friday evening. I'm grateful to the Law and Political Economy Project and Yale Law School for sponsoring this event. And I wanted to start by suggesting that we've heard really excellent comments about the election, about what the election means, about our democracy in connection with voting. I wanted to take our discussion forward and talk about something that this election might mean for policy in the future. And so I wanted to talk about what we call, Professor Ramirez and I in the paper that we're writing, unwinding the war on drugs as an anti-racist moment. So in 1971, Richard Nixon, President of the United States, declared drug abuse as public enemy number 1. In 1986, Ronald Reagan embraced the war on drugs, militarized, weaponized, and incentivized the war on drugs. And in 1994, Bill Clinton put the war on drugs on steroids. President Reagan through the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act, President Clinton through the 1994 Crime Bill. And at this moment in time where I think we have an inflection, where I think, and my hope is that this isn't partisan. We have an inflection moment based on the summer of racial and social unrest with a new election, with a new administration taking office, to think hard about whether the war on drugs makes sense any longer. Here's why I think it's really important to unwind the war on drugs. There is strong evidence to suggest that the war on drugs was never really about minimizing the use of drugs throughout the United States or stemming the flow of drugs into the United States. In fact, there's strong evidence to indicate that the war on drugs was really about a new or re-subordination of African American and Latinx citizens in the United States. And if there's any doubt as to why that may be in question, that the war on drugs was really about resubordination, I wanted to read you something that was presented by John Ehrlichman in a, in a comment that he made in 2016 in a newspaper report. Paraphrasing, John Ehrlichman was the domestic policy advisor of Richard Nixon. Paraphrasing, he said, after 1968, the Nixon administration had two enemies, the anti-war left and blacks. If we could associate the anti-war left with marijuana and blacks with marijuana and heroin, and then we criminalized both in ways that would completely disrupt their communities, we could prevail against our enemies, blacks and anti-Vietnam War left citizens, and we could develop a Southern strategy that would allow us to imprison all of these individuals for drug crimes. And then he says at the end of the interview in the article, John Ehrlichman does, did we know that we were lying about drugs? Yes, it was political. So one of the things that also proves, in my view, that the war on drugs wasn't really ever about stemming the tide of drugs in the United States or ending drug use in the United States is the fact that in 1986, when Ronald Reagan militarized and weaponized the war on drugs, he also incentivized federally reticent local law enforcement leadership, those that were not buying that drug abuse was public enemy number one or that it was one of the major concerns in the country. Any local law enforcement agency through law that would make drug enforcement priority number one could receive federal funding and federal military weaponry, where militarized tanks, assault rifles, battering rams, military helicopters would be given over to local law enforcement to enforce the war on drugs on the streets of America. This is why the war on drugs was about subordination and not about stemming the tide of drugs in the US. It is a common fact, common knowledge, that drug use is rampant on Wall Street. Wall Street traders and bankers use drugs at significantly high levels. It is also true, and those of you here that are students will back me up on this, it's also true that drug use is prevalent on college campuses, in fraternity houses and in sorority houses. But the important point here is, can you imagine a time where a battering ram, a SWAT technical team, a military tank has ever cruised down Park Avenue or the Upper West Side or Upper East Side in Manhattan? When is the last time battering rams and a SWAT tactical team raided a fraternity house or a sorority house? That use of weaponry against American citizenry happens on the streets of urban and poor minority communities throughout the United States, suggesting that the war on drugs was really not about stemming the tide, but about waging a war on minority communities in the United States of America. And so this is what Professor Ramirez and I posit. Mass incarceration and the war on drugs, right? The incarceration rate in the United States spiked after the 1970s, after the war on drugs was called. Our prisons are teeming with African-American and Latinx citizens, not with Wall Street traders, not with college students. It is teeming with African-American and minority drug users. And we posit that mass incarceration follows logically in the line of racial subordination, starting with slavery, evolving into, after emancipation, the Black codes and convict leasing, evolving into mass lynching, evolving into Jim Crow in the United States. And when in 1964, in the Civil Rights Act, in 1965, in the Voting Rights Act, when we finally end Jim Crow and Brown versus Board of Education, just a couple of years later, we have the war on drugs declared by Richard Nixon and the re-subordination of African-American and Latinx citizens occurs in the United States. And to Professor Ramirez's point about felon disenfranchisement, if you're able to lock up African-American and Latinx voters writ large based on the war on drugs, you are also disabling many of their ability to vote long-term. So if it's true that the war on drugs was racially motivated, that it wasn't about drugs, it was about resubordination as we posit, we know that the war on drugs has eviscerated Black urban communities throughout the United States. Families have been fractured. Black male population in many urban city centers is almost non-existent because so many men have been locked up, and increasingly women, based on this racial war on drugs. So if this inflection moment, if this election means that we may be able to, in a nonpartisan way, move forward, our suggestion is that we unwind the war on drugs by legislatively removing the federal government from drug policy and drug enforcement in the United States. If in fact the drug enforcement and the controlled substances list and all of the harsh, thank you, Corinne, all of the harsh drug laws were instituted for a racial subordination purpose, then let's get the federal government out of drug policy completely. Remove marijuana from the controlled substances list, remove federal law enforcement from enforcing drug policy, and our novel, if not logical conclusion, is let the states decide for themselves how to enforce drug policy throughout the United States. If we remove federal enforcement that is tainted with racism and racial subordination, and allow states like Colorado, who legalized early, and Washington, who legalized marijuana early. 10 days ago, the state of Oregon voted to decriminalize possession of all small amounts of drug substances, such that we put the drug policy in the hands of the states to vote, in the hands of the states to make it a public health policy rather than a criminal policy. And if we can commute sentences and expunge records and restore voting rights, we will truly be on a road to a democracy by eliminating the pernicious involvement of the federal government in drug policy and drug enforcement throughout the country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Cummings. Next up, we have Professor Torres. Oh, you need to unmute yourself.
Well, I said I'll try to be brief, but I guess not unmuting myself was then it took more time. I feel like the task that's been placed in front of us is to kind of stir the ashes that are left after the election and after 4 years of the past regime. So I'm going to try to do a couple of things. I'm going to try to figure out what Trumpism is, right? So that it suggests that it's more than just Trump. There were, as my other panelists have mentioned, right, 71 million people who voted to continue the Trump administration. That's not an insignificant number, and they were voting for something. And so the question is, what were they voting for? Just as a footnote here, I suppose, I was actually scheduled to give a talk about environmental justice to the EPA, but because of the president's edict, it was canceled. Perhaps I'll get a chance to do that later on. So what is Trumpism? I think what Trumpism did, and it's a combination of both kind of the racial politics that define American cultural life and American political life, as well as a kind of centralization of the idea of kind of individual responsibility, although even that's questionable. There's some poll stuff that I want to talk about, right? But what it did is it accelerated and used race as the wedge, accelerated the movement from what the government ought to be doing, under Trump. And I think this is part of what defines Trumpism, is not to provide, not to care, right? Not to provide for citizens, not to address needs that the economy doesn't satisfy, or where there's quote market failure, other kinds of disabilities, but to accelerate the move from, I'll call it, from care to control. And so there's been a vast increase in the carceral budget, whether you want to look at it through the lens of just the criminal justice system, but I think you can also look at it in a really plain way through the immigration policy that has been basically at work since day one. So the vast economic inequality that exists in our society took the structural form of moving away from care and into control. And so I think looking at how the people will be controlled is one place we have to look. There's 648 billionaires in the United States. There are 23 million people who are hungry every day in the United States. The interests of those two groups are radically different. The government does not serve the interests of those two groups in the same way. It views one that has to be cared for and one that has to be controlled. And so when you examine policy, I think that's one of the lenses I'm going to suggest you need to look at. One of the things that accelerated under Trumpism as well is the linkage between race and citizenship. That is of course the trope of the ineligibility of Obama for the presidency, and then the claim that was trotted out against Harris of her being ineligible. Right? There's Oakland is, I guess, different from Kenya, but it wasn't that. It was the question of whether she could even be a citizen based on her lineage, right? And it would try to focus on issues that we see that are tied to the immigration, right? Because what the claim was, her parents weren't here to become a part of the country; they were here to get to go to school, go to graduate school, and so that intent shouldn't, by virtue of Kamala being born in Oakland, shouldn't confer citizenship on her. The trope, the place that you can see this is the trope, and it continues to exist now, that the trope of the so-called legal vote, right? The idea of legal votes. We will count every legal vote. Well, the category of what falls into an illegal vote would be those votes that are cast by people who are not citizens, and that would include, I mean, I'm using this broadly, right? It would include all those people who have an attenuated claim to membership in the polity. That means Black people and people of color, but especially Latinos. So if you look at the border policy, right, you see in its some of the most brutal and naked form of control of a quote alien population. So the linkage between race and citizenship was part of Trumpism as well. The other thing that is accelerated is the use of, and you'll see this in arguments from the court, the use of the First Amendment as a way to challenge what would otherwise be valid regulations. And we saw that, since 1976, when the commercial speech doctrine was born. What's happened, of course, is the use of that doctrine to attack regulations. The classic example, which hasn't gotten commented on much, is the Sorrell case from, 5 or 6 years ago, maybe 7 years ago. right, in which Vermont tried to prohibit the sale of your medical your medical information to drug companies. And the court held that the drug companies, that is the data miners, had a First Amendment right to collect that data and to sell it. So I'm still not clear what the First Amendment claim is, but that process has been accelerated as well. So I guess the question I'm going to end with is Trumpism, right, an expression of a new form of capitalism that we're in, state monopoly capitalism, where the states, the banks, large corporations, all right, are function right in a symbiotic relationship that then produces the policies that we see that have the effects on the vast majority of the American people, but the imposition of race as a way to deflect from the economic policies, I think is actually critical. The one glimmer of hope, right, as I look at this, is the rise of the stakeholder critiques of corporate responsibility, as opposed to the kind of the obligation to shareholders that has dominated both legal economic analysis over the last generation. And the stakeholder critique suggests that if we go back to the roots of corporate life, right, what you discover is that they were created for a purpose, and they were created for a purpose that in fact implicates the communities, implicates the various stakeholders, labor, communities, neighborhoods, towns, etc. It'll be interesting to see how that critique evolves. It's already emerging in the legal literature. It's emerging in the popular literature as well. Finally, I guess the pandemic, COVID, highlights all of the inequalities that I've outlined. It also masks or provides an opening for the economic policy that I suggested is what characterizes Trumpism. So the use of race and the transformed capitalism is at the heart of Trumpism, and it's what will survive Donald Trump. Thank you. Thanks
so much. Professor Ramirez, do we want to go back through in the same order? Do you all just want to have a conversation? What do you think how do you envision the next period?
I'm open to either approach. We could go back to Professor Ellis, or if someone else wants to jump in for a few minutes and respond to the first round of comments, that's cool too. Should we go back to Professor Ellis then?
Sure.
As I was listening to my colleagues, I was thinking about how the through line through all of these conversations is, the manipulation of race, the obfuscation of race. I think that there's a lot to be said here about the kind of intersection of like race, political power, and economic power. And I think this builds a running theme, right? I hear it both in terms of Professor Jordan and sort of pairing together sort of the economics of this situation with the kind of obfuscation of race in terms of talking about the Bradley effect, right? And that plays a political role in terms of, polling having taken a beating in this election. Professor Ramirez and Professor Cummings in both their joint project and, this evocation of like what Professor Torres referred to as sort of having attenuated claims to the polity, Ramirez and Cummings both speak to this in terms of how felon status colludes with voting as a level of exclusion on the one hand, and then the war on drugs on the other, to sort of kind of demark this sort of political status. And Professor Torres, you know, sort of locating this in terms of Trumpism as sort of the new mechanism of these things. You know, to me, this is the through line of the panel. And I guess part of the question I'm left with is, well, two questions. One question is thinking about the fact that the democratic values that get proclaimed seem hollow, to put it quite blandly, in relation to the account that this panel has rendered. And to me, the big question that comes out of all this is, how do we inculcate different and new values, right? I think there might be a moment of hope to sort of say, well, the 75 million people who voted for Biden outvoted the 71 million people who voted for Trump. But that divide illustrates the values gap. And that divide also doesn't include the sort of last third of Americans who didn't vote, right? And who seem content to have the decision left. But that leads to a second question of, is the intersection of the political and economic process even the route that we should be taking to address these issues? I mean, part of the sort of left-leaning project of the law generally, as Professor Ramirez referred to, is sort of, you know, politics is law, which means, I mean, a corollary to that seems to be that using legal mechanisms to provide an interpositional remedy to debates created because the culture is at tension with itself will rarely work, right? It takes a third kind of force to come in. And I mean, at the other major point of inflection, at least in terms of America's racial history, the arc that ended with the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, when the country actually became a multiracial democracy, you know, that ball started rolling because of the shaming by the Soviets of the US. You know, I mean, that ball started with Brown, but as Derek Bell and Mary Dulcic, generations apart, but in their work, they both point out, well, that wasn't because white people suddenly decided not to be racist. That was because American democracy and American capitalism were at threat. So, you know, at least these are the questions that come up for me as I hear my panelists. And I'll just hand it to Professor Jordan.
Great. The comments that I have in mind are centered on a core operative factor in our society, and it is the economic inequality which we have, where 20% of the society owns the 90% of the wealth. And the mechanisms to keep that inequality in place are in the hands of public entities like the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is the most powerful economic distributive force in the world. The central bank of the United States is now the central bank of the world. And what we saw after the collapse of financial markets because of manipulation and fraud was the Federal Reserve used an old statute. They dusted off a statute from 1932 And that statute provides unlimited power for the Federal Reserve where there is an urgent and exigent circumstance. Who defines that? The Federal Reserve in secret meetings, meaning it's not open to the public. 5 out of 7 votes on the Board of Governors gets an outcome, which is a declaration that we are in an urgent or emergent situation. And therefore, it unleashes powers to distribute $17 trillion of wealth in the financial crisis. And it's happening again. With the pandemic, we are seeing the same play. The Federal Reserve has set up lending facilities for corporations, and it is only through Congress that we get the stimulus efforts. And the Federal Reserve story, and this is a standard story from liberals to conservatives in the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve can't do anything about economic inequality. We don't do that. Our tools are not suited. We raise interest rates, we lower interest rates, and we keep the financial system stable. And so whenever there's a crisis, the financial crisis of 2008 and the pandemic crisis declared as well in 2020, we give money to the banks. That's how we got the Paycheck Protection Program grift, where banks took $24 billion out of the pot before it even got to anyone. They ushered their crony friends to the front of the line to receive that $660 billion allocated by Congress. So I would end my observations by saying there is a bill. It's going to require, of course, that the Senate is in Democratic hands, but Maxine Waters has a bill to mandate equal representation and equality considerations for every act the Federal Reserve takes. And this would include in emergencies. So these emergencies we've had in the 12-year period have opened the door for enhanced economic inequality by virtue of the power we give to the Federal Reserve. And it has to be challenged, it has to be curtailed, and there's efforts underway for that. So COVID or self-induced grift of the 2008 bank failures, either one, both of them are treated the same by the Federal Reserve. And the money goes into the banks. The banks suffer no loss, their shareholders suffer no loss, and not one dime goes to the individual. This is notwithstanding the fact that the statute, the law that allows them to have these extraordinary powers in an emergency, provides for giving money in an emergency to individuals, partnerships, and corporations. Never has the Federal Reserve given money to individuals. And I'll stop there. This has to be attacked. It has to be remedied. This is the core of our weak position in a capitalist society, starting with slavery, and it's continuing. Neo-slavery, depressed wages, credit fillers for income gaps. These are things that reinforce that economic entrenchment. So, I'll stop there.
I'll just pick up right where you left off, Professor Jordan, because I think this Trumpism that Professor Torres referred to, I think, is a fascinating dynamic. When I think about exactly what Trumpism was and what it might morph into, now that those 71 million votes have been cast and Trump seems to be on his way out, but those 71 million voters are still with us, right? 72 million actually, at last count. What exactly does it mean? Well, I think first and foremost, it's the exploitation of divisions that Professor Cummings talked about with the Southern strategy and the war on drugs. It's the hatred that Professor Torres referred to at the southern border. I have an article out in the Harvard Latinx Law Review that talks about the hatred at the southern border and separating children from their families and putting detainees in cages and overcrowded facilities, notwithstanding a pandemic. I think it's about fostering hatred. I referred in my primary comments to the spike in hate crimes, and you see it everywhere, this hatred that Americans now have for other Americans, right? What better way to encourage and strengthen our adversaries than to set Americans against Americans? And I think all of this is a part and parcel of the dynamic of Trumpism that certainly is still with us after the election. And then the final point is, and it almost turns it into a cult, because the final point is a denial of reality and the substitution of what Trump himself has referred to as alternative facts and alternative reality, right? So we deny mass incarceration. We deny that Black lives matter. We deny that there's a racial hierarchy. We deny COVID-19 and the efficacy of masks. We deny climate change, right? And all of that brings tremendous human suffering and pain. And meanwhile, what's going on behind the curtain while we're pitted against each other and we hate each other and we're divided against each other, and all this pain that is part and parcel of the exploitation of divisions of Trumpism, massive transfer of wealth that Professor Jordan refers to, runaway inequality. And I think ultimately, if we don't do something about it right away, we're going to have a weaker, more fractured United States that is less responsive to human needs and the needs of the citizens of the United States. And sooner or later is going to run into some kind of catastrophic crash, whether it's economic, political, or international, because it goes back to what Abraham Lincoln said: a house divided against itself cannot stand. And that is what Trumpism is all about. It's about dividing the United States of America.
I just checked the popular vote right now. It's 78 million Biden and 72 million Trump. And the reason I mention this is because the previous high participation vote was 69 million for President Obama, I believe, in 2008. And so we have two candidates that have both bested the high water mark as far as the popular vote is concerned, which exacerbates the point that we've made repeatedly on this panel, that we are a divided country with a significant number of people that support what we've labeled as Trumpism in this particular panel. I wanted to mention two things, and then I'm going to get a jump on the Q&A, because I wanted to pose a question to both Professor Torres and Professor Jordan. My two comments are these. When you have a war on drugs that's locking up hundreds of thousands, in fact, our incarcerated population currently is 2 million, hundreds of thousands of African American and Latinx men and women, you're locking up human beings first. Secondly, you're locking up fathers and mothers second. Third, you're locking up breadwinners, people that can actually work and provide for their family. The evisceration of the communities that I reference isn't really ultimately just about removing individuals from the community. It's removing stability from the community. It's literally removing the ability for people to live in a family situation, however you define family. Live in a family where rent is paid and food is on the table. And so the war on drugs and its pernicious racial subordination has literally crushed communities and families of color throughout the United States. And that shouldn't be a partisan issue. That shouldn't be deciding to end the war on drugs and unwind it. Shouldn't be something that's partisan. It just should be that we care about our fellow human beings. We care about families. We care about communities. And if in fact what I feel like I've shown as true today, that the very roots of the war on drugs were based on subordinating votes of people of color and destroying communities of people of color, then the humane response to that is ending it and commuting sentences and expunging records. And more than anything else, and Ibram Kendi makes this point very clear in his book, Stamped from the Beginning and How to Be an Anti-Racist, is that it's ultimately about jobs and opportunity. And if you think about the trillions, and I do mean trillions with a T, of dollars that we have spent waging this war on drugs, that to this day has not minimized the use of drugs in this country or stemmed the flow of drugs into this country or the manufacturing of illicit drugs within the country. If we use those trillions of dollars to actually provide opportunity to the communities crushed by the war on drugs, then we actually have an opportunity to reverse the damage that we've done based on pernicious federal involvement in the drug trade. And then the last comment I'll make is, and I see the person that posed the comment in the chat box just had to sign off, but Mason Marks said you can't really let states be in charge of drugs because then conservative states would continue to wage the war on drugs. And I would just like to respond to that comment by suggesting that in Arkansas, which overwhelmingly supported Trump, where I work at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, William H. Bowen School of Law, this state voted two or 3 years ago for medicinal marijuana and is gathering signatures after COVID to put recreational marijuana on the ballot. And I'm not so sure that the people of the conservative states aren't going to recognize that, that legalizing marijuana and decriminalizing other drugs isn't the answer to the economic misfortune that the war on drugs puts on both rural and urban families. So here's my jump on the Q&A section, and this goes to Professor Torres and Professor Jordan, although Ellis and Ramirez could definitely weigh in. What are your thoughts on private industry being a part of the solution? And what I mean by that is the Washington NFL club was staunchly against removing the name from their team until FedEx and Boeing said, we are going to remove our financial support of your team and your stadium if you don't quit referring to yourselves as the Washington Redskins. And the other comment that I will make quickly is that Citigroup just pledged $30 billion to economic equality and to promoting diversity within its ranks. Bank of America, American Express, many, many others have pledged billions and multiples of millions of dollars to trying to respond to the economic inequality problem we've been discussing. So to Professor Torres and Jordan, after you speak, Professor Torres, I'm wondering if you will speak to whether you think there's any hope in the private industry providing a path forward to some of the economic inequality that we've talked about today. I think I know your answer, Professor Jordan, but I hope that we'll be able to.
I can speak for myself, and I will. What I would say is I have no faith, no hope that the private sector will be a real solution. All of the things that you've identified, the support for economic equality, JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, these are acts of performance to enhance their reputation and take a tax deduction for the contributions they are making. So these are performances for reputational enhancement, and it gives some money to some people, but it doesn't change the structure of economic inequality, which would be change. Universal basic income could change that. A universal jobs program could change that. But more importantly, we have to recognize that these financial institutions are performing charitable acts for tax deductions. These are cynical moves, and unless you recognize that, the optimism is misplaced.
And I misidentified. It is J.P. Morgan Chase that pledged the $30 billion.
Oh, J.P. Morgan Chase. Oh.
Professor Torres,
how many trillions they got in the financial crisis with no strings attached. I mean, and this current pledge is tax deductible charitable contributions. So it's going in one pocket, coming out the other, and the pockets are our pockets because the taxpayers will ultimately experience this loss of revenue because of charitable deductions. And JP Morgan Chase gets a reputational boost that is undeserved.
Yeah, I guess I would say that turning to private corporations as a way out is probably the wrong path. It certainly is not the path that I would propose. But rather than taking any time speaking, since we have 10 minutes left, I'd like to turn to the questions in the queue. Let people who have been here listening ask questions if you have any.
Yeah, that's great. We should do that.
Okay, let's start with Elizabeth Kimball. If you just unmute yourself, I think that should work.
Hi, I hope everybody can hear me. We have lots of, excellent, thank you. We had lots of discussion about the vote totals and how both sides turned out in record numbers this year. And I've seen a lot of conversation about what to do with the voters. Do we fold them in? Do we bury the hatchet, or do we, should there be consequences for their behavior and their beliefs and what they've done? Like, what's the best way to move forward with this?
Well, I have a response, but I don't know whether I should put my better angel hat on or my bad angel hat on. But so first thing I want to say is what it tells us, and I think Professor Ellis talked about this, is kind of reforming the electoral system is actually critical. There are a number of people who would have voted and probably would have voted for the side that I would have liked, right, who were basically prohibited from voting. My good friend Lonnie Guinier, what the project she was working on, it was a project that she called One Vote, One Value, and that means that the census matters, right? So that one person, one vote doesn't actually capture the way the votes are weighted and valued.
Yeah.
And so I think a thoroughgoing review and reform of the democratic processes in general is necessary. I also think that the economic interests of some of those 72 million, I guess it is, actually make them our allies. I think the imposition of the racial script that Trumpism used so deftly, although ham-handedly too, but is something that has to just be confronted. Just saying all is forgiven is not exactly the path I want to go, but to say what stresses were you feeling that this president, this economic program that they were outlining solves for you, and have that discussion. The Green New Deal is actually something that could end up providing jobs for folks who find themselves in extremis. The economic impact of COVID is catastrophic. It's catastrophic, right? And we've barely begun to confront that. The way we confront it will be a way into that 72 million.
I would say in the short term, these voters have to be mobilized and their finances directed to finishing the project. Those 2 seats in Georgia in the short term are the path to legislative reform and all of the things that we think are necessary that require the current structure. Now, we can think about the future and different structures, but the structure we have, at least until January 5th, when that runoff election takes place, will require winning those 2 seats. And that's like the Obama said, you vote like, or you send your money, if you don't live in Georgia, to those 2 seats to finish the project. Because in the short term, if the Senate is in the hands of the Grim Reaper, Mitch McConnell, self-named, nothing's going to get through. And the things that are done by executive order are reversed in the next backlash.
So I want to raise a different point. I agree with my colleagues, but there is a point that's sort of in the background of this conversation. And I think, you know, even before you can get a reconciliation between the 78 who voted for Biden and the 72 who voted for Trump and counting, you know, one of the problems that we have to confront that I don't think has been mentioned yet is something that I call the sort of epistemic crisis that we face in America today, which is my way of saying those 2 voting blocks have 2 different ways of knowing the reality that we see in America today, right? And I think this gets to some of these comments about, ultimately about oligarchy, right? Because Trump is an idol to be adored by certain of the voters who voted for him. And there is the tacit endorsement of Trumpist policies, even if they don't believe themselves racist and subordinationist and et cetera. But then the folks who didn't vote for him see the world a different way. This whole problem of alternative facts as a long-term conversation, you know, needs to be confronted, right? And otherwise folks are going to be talking past each other. And that talking past each other, mobilized by things like the meme of voter fraud that we saw at play in this election, can lead to, well, worst case, blood on the streets. We didn't have that, as Professor Ramirez talked about, but I think there was good reason for everyone to worry about that. And that feeling of an impending overthrow, you know, is also based on that.
Great.
Should we take the next question?
Yeah, so I have one from the chat. It says, is the concern for marginalized communities more a question of jobs, or should we think about it in terms of ownership? Is the conception one of property or industry?
I would say that it's more about security. I think when you look across the world and you see where you have societies with a very happy population, or you have a society where collective action is effective. I'm thinking in particular of Denmark, although there are other societies like Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan. They all performed better in terms of COVID-19, but it's a fundamental sense of security that sort of like makes those societies very resistant to demagoguery and puts them in a position where they're able to do things like national universal health care, higher education for all, including graduate school without crushing debt, but for free. So I think security is the key. So a job guarantee, a real guarantee of health care, which I think would have done wonders in the COVID crisis for protecting our people. Things of that nature, I think, are both pro-human development, pro-economic growth, and pro a more robust, cohesive society.
If I were going to look for, I mean, I'm not sure that the dichotomy you pose is in fact explanatory. I mean, I would look at things like the mutual aid groups that sprang up in the face of COVID, because what that suggests to me is a different way of organizing economic life. You know, it's an old idea, but it actually has worked, and it's working in some places where I have friends. So that what economic system is going to be born, I think is critical. The share of the wealth is what we have to think about. And you know, if you think about it solely in terms of ownership, that's one way to think about it. In terms of jobs, I think Professor Ramirez's idea that what people really want is, or what they desire and need as a necessary first condition is security. I think is actually right.
I would like to add into the conversation that Denmark, we can long for Denmark and Japan's ability to provide for its people, but you have to recognize those are homogeneous populations. We have as our strength, really, this pluralism, which is a part of the attraction of America for immigrants, a place for people who are not a part of the founding cohort in the racial hierarchy. And we have the problem of slavery, which, as my dear friend, the late Derek Bell, used to say, we're the faces at the bottom of the well. And it seems never to subside. So that's just a comment about conflating the description of societies that are radically different from ours in the composition of the population. And those differences have to do with pluralism versus homogeneity, and with the hierarchy established by the racial caste system that is with us today. Are we at the end of our time?
We're supposed to go to 6:30. I don't know if people want one more question.
I think we have time for one more question if there's a question out there.
That'd be great.
We don't have one in the queue. If anyone would like to raise their hand, that would be great.
So I have 6:31.
All right. Well, this may be, if anybody wants to offer any concluding thoughts, maybe we'll do it that way and go ahead and call it an evening. But thank you all so much for doing this. This has been a really amazing panel. But I do want to give you a chance to offer final thoughts.
The only final thought I would offer is that the transformation will come from the people themselves, and that's where we need to look. And they'll transform not just institutions, but transform law. And so social activism, social movements, especially those that are grounded in a vision of justice and a vision of equality, are the places we have to look. And at least that's the place I'm looking.
And I would add to that Tuesday was a reprieve. The work that Professor Torres refers to is very important work that we all have to be involved in, because those 72 million voters are not going away, and they're our co-citizens. So we got a reprieve to embrace them and hopefully have them embrace the fundamental value of the United States, where we're unified and diverse all at once.
I would just jump in here and respond to actually, Corinne, one of the questions in the chat was, what can we do as individuals? And I want to thank the person that asked that question. And this goes to what Professor Ramirez and Professor Torres were just mentioning. You know, we as individuals, I think, have if we're willing to be boots on the ground and to be activists for social justice, we can actually do something. And I want to just leave this really short anecdote with you. A couple of years ago, I became very offended about for-profit prisons. And I ended up with a lawyer friend in Arizona starting a 501c3 called Abolish Private Prisons. And this is just me and him, two lawyers deciding that we want to file a federal lawsuit challenging the constitution of private prisons. And in August, we filed a lawsuit in Arizona Federal District Court challenging private for-profit incarceration as unconstitutional. We just filed our response to the private prisons motion to dismiss. And I'm just suggesting that if you have a passion, that the kind of boots on the ground work that we're talking about, you can start a 501c3. You can be a part of existing 501c3s to actually try to be a part of the solution. And so that would be my sign-off moment, would be we all have power within us, and we can make a difference, I believe.
I would just say that very simply, part of the project of the democratic structure having the appearance of democracy, but working in ways that entrench minority empowered people with their clear connection to citizenship and excluding those who are outside, is the illusion that that everyone does not have a stake, right? These are all constructs of thinking about democracy that skew us from our ability to exercise our civic duty and to hold our structures and each other accountable. That is the original myth that is in a foundational part of the illusion of democracy, and taking that apart is an important step to get to an authentic multiracial democracy that values equality. So don't believe the hype.
My last comments are, thank you so much to the members of the audience who stayed with us to the end on a Friday and had questions and engaged us. And I'm hoping that our comments were provocative enough, stimulating enough, that you will take something home with you. This is not just an observational experience. I'm hoping that it will stimulate you to know that you as an individual have power, and there are places where that power can be directed to leverage democracy. And I'm hoping that you will do it. This conversation is an important contribution to that, I hope. And I'll end by saying, thanks to the Law and Political Economy Project. It's a wonderful project, and bringing us together in this setting is only one of many efforts of the Yale Law and Political Economy Project. So thank you to them, and thank you to our administrator for this panel. It's all been a beautiful opportunity, and I hope all of those of you who stayed to the bitter end of our discussion will take it home with you and do something with what we are suggesting is available to you.
Well, that seems like an ideal note to end on. Thanks so much.
Take care, everybody. Thank you.